Have you ever felt that, without any clear reason, your family began losing its peace? Conversations became tense, prayers almost disappeared, and little by little, the love that once united you started growing cold. You might have blamed stress, work, or difficult phases, but what if there's something deeper happening? Saint Teresa of Jesus, doctor of the Church and reformer of Carmel, discovered something that modern families desperately need to understand. There's a silent war being waged against the very heart of your home, and most families don't even realize they're under attack. If you want to learn how to protect your family with Saint Teresa's wisdom, subscribe to this channel now so you won't miss more teachings and advice from this great saint. This war doesn't announce itself with dramatic events or obvious crises. It creeps in quietly through small changes that seem insignificant at first. A prayer skipped here, a harsh word there, a growing distance between family members that you can't quite explain. Saint Teresa knew this enemy well. She faced it in her own spiritual life and in the communities she founded. She wrote, "The devil never sleeps, and his greatest joy is seeing a family divided." But she also discovered the weapons to fight back, and today you're going to learn them. The Catholic Church teaches that Christian life is a constant spiritual battle against sin, temptation, and the forces of evil. This battle isn't just individual, it also affects the family, which is the fundamental cell of society and the Church. You are not imagining things when you sense something attacking the peace of your home. Your intuition is correct, and Saint Teresa's centuries-old wisdom can help you understand what you're facing and how to respond with spiritual authority. Saint Teresa of Avila didn't learn about spiritual warfare from books. She learned it in the trenches of her own soul and in the fires of founding 17 convents under constant opposition. When she established the reform of Carmel, she wasn't just organizing religious communities, she was creating fortresses of prayer that would stand against the spiritual darkness of her time. But her greatest battles weren't against external enemies, they were against the subtle attacks that sought to destroy unity, love, and faith from within. In her writings, particularly in The Way of Perfection, Teresa reveals something that shocks many modern readers. The enemy's primary strategy isn't to attack with obvious evil, but to gradually cool the hearts of those who love God and each other. She observed how communities that once burned with fervor could slowly lose their spiritual fire through seemingly minor compromises, small resentments left unaddressed, and the gradual abandonment of the practices that kept them close to Christ. Where prayer grows cold, she warned, love soon follows. You might recognize this pattern in your own family. Perhaps you remember times when your home was filled with laughter, spontaneous prayers, and genuine care for each other's spiritual well-being. But somewhere along the way, things shifted. The family rosary became sporadic, then rare, then absent. Conversations about faith were replaced by arguments about mundane matters. The warmth that once characterized your relationships gave way to a subtle but persistent chill that no one talks about, but everyone feels. Saint Teresa understood that families, like religious communities, need constant vigilance and intentional spiritual practices to maintain their unity and peace. She wrote to her spiritual daughters, "Do not think that because you love God, the enemy has forgotten about you. On the contrary, he studies your habits, your weaknesses, and your relationships more carefully, because he knows that destroying your love for each other is the fastest way to destroy your love for God." This is why recognizing the warning signs is not just helpful, it's essential for your family's spiritual survival. The first sign that Saint Teresa identified is perhaps the most subtle and dangerous: the gradual abandonment of family prayer. It doesn't happen overnight. It starts with skipping the family rosary because everyone is tired, or postponing the blessing before meals because someone is in a hurry. These seem like minor adjustments, reasonable accommodations to busy schedules. But Teresa knew that the enemy's greatest victory is making spiritual negligence seem practical and justified. In The Way of Perfection, she emphasized that prayer is not just a devotional practice, it's the spiritual breathing of the family. Just as a body begins to weaken when it doesn't receive enough oxygen, a family begins to lose its supernatural life when prayer becomes sporadic or disappears entirely. She wrote, "Where there is no prayer, there is no protection. And where there is no protection, the enemy enters as if into an empty house." You might have noticed this in your own home. As prayer decreased, Tensions increased, misunderstandings multiplied, and that inexplicable coldness began to settle over your relationships. The Catechism of the Catholic Church affirms that the family is the first school of prayer, CIC 2685, and when this school closes, the spiritual education of its members suffers dramatically. Children who grow up without seeing their parents pray together struggle to develop their own relationship with God. Spouses who no longer pray together often find their emotional and spiritual intimacy diminishing. The absence of prayer creates a vacuum that other voices of criticism, resentment, and selfishness, quickly fill. But here's what St. Teresa discovered that gives tremendous hope. The enemy works so hard to eliminate prayer from families because he knows how powerful it is in restoring unity and peace. This means that returning to family prayer isn't just a nice devotional practice, it's a weapon of spiritual warfare. When you gather your family to pray, even if it feels awkward at first, even if there's resistance, you're taking back territory that the enemy has been trying to claim. You're declaring that your home belongs to Christ, not to the forces of division and coldness. If this teaching is touching your heart, do something simple but powerful. Write in the comments, St. Teresa, teach my family to pray together again. Your testimony might be the light another family needs to begin their journey back to spiritual unity. And don't forget to share this video with someone whose family needs this message of hope and restoration. St. Teresa discovered that when families begin to drift away from the sacraments, especially the Eucharist and confession, they lose their primary sources of spiritual strength and healing. She observed this pattern repeatedly in the religious communities she reformed. Sisters who became lax about receiving communion regularly often became more vulnerable to temptation, more prone to conflicts, and less capable of genuine charity toward each other. The soul that does not nourish itself with Christ, she wrote, soon becomes weak and cannot resist the smallest difficulties. In your family, this might manifest as Sunday Mass becoming optional rather than essential, as receiving the Eucharist becoming sporadic rather than weekly, and as going to confession shifting from regular practice to something done only in extreme circumstances. These changes often happen gradually, justified by busy schedules, travel, or simply the feeling that God understands. But St. Teresa recognized that this understanding, while containing some truth, can become a trap that gradually separates the family from its most powerful sources of grace and protection. The Catechism teaches that the Eucharist strengthens us against sin, CIC 1389, and that confession heals spiritual wounds, CIC 1458. When families regularly receive these sacraments together, they create a supernatural bond that worldly pressures cannot easily break. But when sacramental life becomes irregular or absent, the family loses these divine reinforcements just when they need them most. You might have noticed that during periods when your family was more consistent about Mass and confession, there was greater peace, more patience with each other's faults, and a deeper sense of shared purpose. St. Teresa's solution was both simple and profound. She established clear expectations and gentle accountability within her communities regarding sacramental life. She didn't rely on individual motivation alone. She created structures that made regular reception of the sacraments easier and more natural. For families, this might mean scheduling a specific time each week for confession, choosing a particular Mass time that everyone can attend together, or making the reception of the Eucharist a moment of conscious family unity. When you return to regular sacramental life as a family, you're not just fulfilling religious obligations. You're rebuilding the spiritual defenses that protect your home from the subtle attacks of division and coldness. Perhaps no warning sign broke St. Teresa's heart more than witnessing how unforgiveness could destroy communities that had once been filled with love and mutual support. She wrote extensive letters to her spiritual daughters about sisters who had allowed small hurts to grow into permanent resentments, and how these hidden wounds became entry points for the enemy to sow greater division. Unforgiveness, she observed, is like a wound that we refuse to let heal, and infected wounds spread their poison throughout the entire body. In families, this manifests as grudges held between spouses, children who feel constantly criticized and withdraw emotionally, or parents who struggle to forgive past mistakes and continuously remind family members of their failures. These resentments often remain unspoken, creating an atmosphere of tension that everyone feels but no one addresses directly. St. Paul's warning becomes reality. Do not let the sun go down on your anger and give no opportunity to the devil. Ephesians 4:26-27. When anger is allowed to fester overnight, it transforms into something harder and more destructive. The Catechism emphasizes that holding resentments is an obstacle to grace, CIC 2840. But St. Teresa understood something deeper. Unforgiveness doesn't just block grace from entering our hearts, it actively invites spiritual attack. She noticed that communities where forgiveness was practiced quickly and generously were much more resistant to external pressures and internal conflicts. Conversely, communities where hurts were nursed and resentments cultivated became vulnerable to divisions that seemed to come from nowhere, but actually had deep roots in unhealed wounds. You know this dynamic if you've ever experienced how a small disagreement in your family can suddenly explode into a major conflict that brings up issues from months or years ago. That escalation happens because unresolved hurts create spiritual vulnerability, and the enemy of family unity knows exactly how to exploit those weak points. But Saint Teresa also discovered the antidote: families that practice regular, specific forgiveness, not just general goodwill, but actual acknowledgement of hurts and deliberate choice to release resentment. Create a spiritual atmosphere where peace can flourish and attacks lose their power. Saint Teresa lived during a time when various spiritual movements were challenging traditional Catholic teaching, and she witnessed firsthand how families and communities that began to compromise on fundamental truths gradually lost their spiritual strength and unity. She wrote, "When we begin to think that perhaps the Church doesn't understand our particular situation, or that times have changed so much that ancient wisdom no longer applies, we open our hearts to confusions that seem reasonable but lead us away from the path of life." In modern families, this relativization often begins with seemingly reasonable accommodations. Faith is important, but we shouldn't be too rigid about church teachings. Or what matters is being a good person, not following specific doctrines. Or we need to be understanding of different lifestyles and choices, even if they contradict what we used to believe. These attitudes can seem charitable and open-minded, but Saint Teresa recognized them as subtle attacks on the foundation that holds families together in truth and authentic love. The Catechism warns against false thoughts and doctrines that appear enlightened but actually weaken fidelity to Christ, CIC 675. When families begin to pick and choose which teachings to follow based on comfort or social acceptability rather than truth, they create internal divisions that manifest in confusion, arguments about moral issues, and children who grow up uncertain about what their family actually believes. This uncertainty becomes a source of anxiety and conflict that seems to have no clear resolution. Saint Teresa's approach was to ground her communities deeply in authentic church teaching, while showing how these teachings, far from being burdensome, actually provide the framework for genuine freedom and peace. She understood that truth isn't restrictive. It's liberating because it shows us reality as it actually is rather than as we might wish it to be. Families that maintain clear commitment to Catholic teaching while expressing it with love and patience create an environment of security where children can grow spiritually strong and spouses can trust each other's moral compass, even in difficult decisions. One of the most heartbreaking patterns Saint Teresa observed was how communities could gradually lose their sense of the sacred, particularly regarding the infinite value of each human person created in God's image. She saw how environments that once treated every individual as precious could slowly become places where some people were valued more than others, where convenience became more important than conscience, and where the culture of the world gradually replaced the culture of the gospel. In families today, this often manifests in subtle ways: entertainment choices that normalize violence or sexual exploitation, conversations that devalue the elderly or the unborn, or decision-making processes that prioritize material success over moral integrity. You might notice how certain topics become off-limits in family discussions, not because they're too complex for children, but because adults have grown uncomfortable with the Church's clear teachings about the dignity of all human life from conception to natural death. The Catechism is unambiguous about the Church's teaching on the sanctity of life, CIC 2258. But Saint Teresa understood that intellectual agreement with doctrine isn't enough. Families need to cultivate a lived appreciation for the sacred that permeates their daily choices and conversations. When this appreciation diminishes, family members begin to see each other differently too. Children become burdens rather than blessings. Elderly relatives become problems to be solved rather than wisdom to be treasured. And spouses begin to evaluate each other based on usefulness rather than inherent dignity. But Saint Teresa also discovered that families can recover this sense of the sacred through intentional practices, blessing each family member regularly, speaking about the unique gifts God has given each person, making sacrifices for the most vulnerable members of the family, and choosing entertainment and conversations that reinforce rather than undermine human dignity. When families consciously choose to create a culture of life within their homes, they not only protect themselves from spiritual attack, they become beacons of hope in a world that desperately needs to rediscover the infinite value of every human person. Saint Teresa understood that authentic love is the lifeblood of any spiritual community, and she observed with deep concern how the enemy's most effective attacks often targeted love itself, not by promoting obvious hatred, but by gradually cooling the warmth, tenderness, and genuine care that family members once showed each other. She wrote, "Love that grows cold doesn't die suddenly. It fades so slowly that we barely notice until one day we realize we're living as strangers under the same roof." In marriage, this coldness often begins with the erosion of small gestures of affection, appreciation, and attention. Conversations become purely functional, focused on schedules and problems rather than dreams and feelings. Physical affection decreases, not because of major conflicts, but because of accumulated tiredness, distraction, and the gradual sense that romance is a luxury that busy families can't afford. The Catechism teaches that the sacramental grace of marriage is meant to strengthen and deepen love, CIC 1641. But when couples stop nurturing their relationship with intentional acts of love, this grace has less opportunity to work in their hearts. Parental love can also be targeted by this subtle cooling. Parents may continue to provide for their children's material and educational needs while gradually losing the warmth, patience, and genuine enjoyment that characterizes true parental affection. Discipline becomes harsh rather than loving. Praise becomes rare, and the deep satisfaction that parents are meant to find in their children gets replaced by frustration, anxiety, or simple emotional distance. Children sense this change acutely, even when they can't articulate what's happening, and they often respond with behavioral problems or emotional withdrawal that creates even more family stress. Saint Teresa's insight was that love requires the same kind of vigilant attention that prayer requires. It can't be taken for granted or maintained on autopilot. She encouraged her spiritual daughters to make specific daily choices to express love through words, actions, and attention, even when they didn't feel particularly loving. Love is not primarily a feeling, she taught, but a decision that we renew each day. Families that consciously choose to express love through words of affirmation, physical affection, quality time, and acts of service often discover that the feelings of love return and deepen, creating a cycle of warmth that protects the family from spiritual attacks designed to divide and isolate. The final warning sign that Saint Teresa identified is perhaps the most relevant to our current time: the gradual but persistent exposure to influences that subtly undermine Christian values and weaken the family's commitment to living according to gospel principles. In her era, this might have involved books or ideas that questioned fundamental teachings of the faith. Today, these influences come through entertainment, social media, educational environments, and peer relationships that consistently present worldviews contrary to Catholic teaching. Saint Teresa was not advocating for isolation from the world. She was deeply engaged with the culture of her time and founded convents in major cities rather than remote locations. But she understood the difference between engaging with the world as missionaries and being gradually shaped by worldly values without realizing it. She wrote, "We must be in the world, but not of the world, which means we choose our influences carefully and always with reference to what brings us closer to or further from our Lord." The Catechism warns that we must discern what we see and hear, CIC 2496, but many families have lost the habit of this discernment. Movies, music, books, and social media content that normalize behaviors contrary to Christian teaching gradually shift family attitudes and expectations. Children absorb messages about sexuality, success, relationships, and meaning that directly contradict what their parents claim to believe. creating internal conflicts and confusion that manifest as family tension and rebellion. However, Saint Teresa discovered that families don't need to withdraw from modern life to protect themselves from these influences. They need to become more intentional about creating positive influences that are stronger than the negative ones. This means choosing entertainment that reinforces rather than undermines family values, discussing current events from a Catholic perspective, and creating family traditions and conversations that help everyone understand how to live faithfully in a challenging world. When families take active responsibility for shaping their cultural environment rather than passively accepting whatever influences surround them, they discover a strength and unity that can withstand even the most persistent spiritual attacks. Now that you understand the 7 warning signs, you might feel overwhelmed by how many ways the enemy can attack your family's peace and unity. But Saint Teresa's greatest gift to families isn't just diagnostic, it's therapeutic. She didn't just identify the problems, she lived and taught the solutions. Her centuries of experience in spiritual warfare, combined with her profound mystical insights, provide families today with a tested arsenal of weapons that can not only defend against attack, but actually strengthen family bonds beyond what they were before the attacks began. The foundation of Saint Teresa's approach is what she called vigilant love, a combination of spiritual awareness and practical charity that creates an atmosphere where attacks lose their power. This begins with regular family prayer, but not just any prayer. Prayer that specifically asks for protection from division, coldness, and deception, and prayer that includes examination of conscience about how family members are treating each other. She also emphasized the crucial importance of frequent reception of the sacraments as a family, understanding that the Eucharist and confession provide supernatural strength that human effort alone cannot supply. Perhaps most importantly, Saint Teresa taught that families must create what she called holy conversation, regular times when family members talk not just about practical matters, but about their faith, their struggles, their gratitude, and their hopes. These conversations create emotional and spiritual intimacy that makes family members much more resistant to external influences and internal conflicts. She wrote, "Families that pray together and talk together about sacred things create a fortress of love that the enemy cannot penetrate." The victory that Saint Teresa promises isn't the absence of all problems or conflicts. It's the presence of a peace and unity that can withstand difficulties without breaking. Families that implement her teachings often discover that they not only survive spiritual attacks, but emerge from them stronger, more unified, and more consciously dependent on God's grace. They become witnesses to the power of authentic Christian family life in a world that desperately needs to see that such life is not only possible but joyful, fulfilling, and eternally significant. Your family can be one of these witnesses, starting today with the first small step of recognizing the battle and choosing to fight it with the weapons of prayer, sacraments, forgiveness, truth, love, and vigilant protection of your family.